Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join me this afternoon for today's webinar. It's very much appreciated. I hope you've all got a lovely sunny Friday afternoon, same as I've got here in Edinburgh, and got an exciting sunny weekend planned as well. So once again, thanks very much for taking the time to join me. I think we will probably just take around about 30 minutes or so today to run through some slides, and I'll be happy to take any questions afterwards as well. You'll be able to see in the little pane, the GoToWebinar pane, there's a questions box there. You can pull that out and type in any questions as we go. So feel free to type in the questions as I'm speaking, or feel free to wait until the end to type in the questions. Either way, I'll have a look at them towards the end, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions that you have. So today we're going to look at NQA's Net Zero Aligned service. Just a bit of background to NQA first. So for those of you that don't know us as an organisation, we are a UKAS-accredited certification and verification body. I'm Stephen Burt, I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director. So I look after and deliver some of all the sustainability products that we do, including the greenhouse gas verification activity that we undertake. So in the orange box, you can see some of the sustainability and other ISO standards that we provide services around. Generally, almost everything that we do is focused around ISO standards themselves. That's the nature of our business. So I'm based in Edinburgh. You can see the global coverage that we have. The little orange dots are our offices. So that just gives you a bit of an overview to NQA itself as an organisation. A bit of introduction to me. So as I mentioned, I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director. So I've got over 25 years experience in carbon, energy and environmental management, and more recently in net zero topics. I've been with NQA for around about 15 years. Started off as an auditor, and these days I'm the Carbon Sustainability Services Director. I'm currently in the middle of my PhD, which is relevant because this is a net zero related topic, data-driven net zero related topic that I'm studying for my PhD. And I'm also a lead greenhouse gas verifier myself. So I deliver verifications to our clients all around the greenhouse gas verification side of things. And also of relevance is that I sit on the committees which develop ISO standards and provide input for the UK for both the greenhouse gas ISO standards and also for the ISO 14001 environmental schemes as well. So what we'll aim to do today is just to give you an understanding, a bit of context and background around why companies are making net zero commitments, how companies make net zero commitments. We'll look at some of the drivers around the reason that companies do that, as well as the business benefits of doing so. And then we'll have a look more closely at NQA's Net Zero Aligned service itself. And I'll give you an overview as well of our arrangements, how it works, how the Net Zero Aligned process works for client companies. So just context and background first then. So I'm sure you're aware carbon dioxide is a global warming gas, a greenhouse gas. This is the kind of thing that I like to spend my spare time looking at. This is NASA data. It gets updated once a month, and it shows using historical ice core data as well as modern monitoring and measuring data, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere overall. And you can see the very, very steep increase in recent years since the Industrial Revolution. And on the right hand side there, you can see the graph shows seasonal fluctuations, very obvious seasonal fluctuations in the concentration. But at the minute, the latest measurement on the NASA website is in March, which was 428 parts per million carbon dioxide. And you can see from the graph on the left hand side that for millennia, the atmospheric carbon dioxide's never been above 300 parts per million until 1911 itself. And then that correlates very nicely with the increases in global average temperatures as well. So just on the very right hand side of that chart, you can probably see for the first time ever recently, the global temperature anomaly exceeded 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the reason that's relevant is because the United Nations have an overall goal to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but also to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So for the first time ever, that 1.5 degree global temperature anomaly was exceeded very recently. That target, the United Nations target of the 2 degrees above pre-industrial level cap and the effort to limit it to 1.5 degrees, that's essentially what's called a science-based target. So there's lots of science behind why those numbers have been chosen, and that's relevant because that's important to the commitments that companies make and the targets that they set in relation to net zero alignment. So scientists agree the most critical issue facing the climate is the planet is climate change then, and of course the UK government has a statutory commitment. 2050 is the target date for the country to be net zero. UK led the way with that very early. They set that target. Most nations have followed and done the same now. So what that net zero target for the country as a whole is linked to the science-based target that we've just looked at. So when it comes to company level rather than country level, the drive towards decarbonisation, it's mainly driven by supply chain pressures and stakeholder expectations. To a lesser extent, various regulatory and policy changes come into effect as well. So as you can imagine, the UK government has published its net zero strategy a while ago. And then every, I think it's 6 or 7 years, they set carbon budget delivery plans as well. And that results in policy changes and regulatory changes as well, which drive decarbonisation within companies. So overall, all of that is leading many companies to make public commitments to be net zero. It's mainly supply chain pressures at the minute that most businesses will be experiencing. So another thing that I like to spend my time doing is looking at the Net Zero Tracker website. So this is really interesting because the Net Zero Tracker website holds companies to account against their publicly disclosed net zero targets. And it's really interesting what it shows. We can see a general increase year on year of how many companies actually have net zero targets. And overall, the Net Zero Tracker website tracks the world's 2,000 largest companies, and of those, around about 2/3 of their revenue is covered by a net zero target overall. So very, very important at corporate level. However, if you look at the Net Zero Tracker website, it suggests that only 1 in 6, or around about 16% of those world's largest 2,000 companies are actually on track to meet their net zero targets by their target date, which is usually 2050, just to link in with the UK government's target date. So lots and lots of companies set net zero targets. Very few are on track to actually achieve them at this stage. And then this is a screen grab from the Net Zero Tracker website as well. So of the 2,000 world's largest companies on this website, 82 of them are UK based. And of those 82, only 10% are identified as having a suitably detailed plan to achieve their target. 60% have got a partially detailed plan, but very worryingly, 30% of them don't have a detailed plan at all to achieve their target. So this website uses a kind of red, amber, green scenario to identify whether the business has a detailed plan, has a reporting mechanism, whether it covers its scope 3 or its indirect, its supply chain, upstream, downstream related greenhouse gas emissions, and also whether they're using carbon credits. And it's well worth having a look at that, because even the world's biggest companies, a lot of them just don't have plans in place. They've made commitments, but they're not able to provide a detailed plan. Some of them can't provide a reporting mechanism, and many of them aren't attempting to tackle their scope 3 emissions within their net zero target itself. So the benefits then for companies who want to quantify and report and manage their greenhouse gas emissions against a science-based net zero target. As I mentioned earlier, it's primarily supply chain pressures that companies experience to report against net zero targets. So therefore it provides an improved competitive advantage when tendering, for example, and winning new customers. There's also an element of risk reduction by managing supply chains. I mentioned previously the changing policy and regulatory environment around carbon reporting. That's becoming more and more common as a result of the country's net zero target by 2050. But we shouldn't forget, of course, that there's environmental improvement and long-term business sustainability issues around climate change and mitigation of climate change impacts as well. So looking at corporate net zero reporting then, and the kind of bit of background to corporate net zero reporting. So other than the net zero tracker website, there's really, often a lack of transparency. There's a lack of accountability for companies reporting against their net zero targets. And that's despite it being of interest to all major stakeholders, the customers, the employees, campaign groups, the government, all these different stakeholders are interested in net zero. So, NQA's net zero aligned service, which we'll look at in a second, it's not anything new really. There are several, sometimes very costly schemes already available for providing assurance of a company's journey to net zero. However, I think there's some weaknesses in those schemes. Generally, they involve, obviously providing verification of a company's greenhouse gas emissions and the progress that company's making towards its net zero target. Often, however, it's only focused on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So thinking back to the screen grab we looked at from the net zero tracker website, many companies are only tackling their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and perhaps some, but not all of their applicable scope 3 emissions being included in that target. For some of the other schemes, companies often simply submit their greenhouse gas data for verification via a portal. So perhaps with no site visits being undertaken to actually verify the data at all, the data sources. At NQA, when we do greenhouse gas verifications, 9 times out of 10 we'll do a site visit, because it's provides that level of credibility and assurance that's needed. Some of the schemes that are available at the minute, there's no UKAS accreditation held for the greenhouse gas verification part of it. So at NQA, we're a UKAS-accredited verification body. UKAS is United Kingdom Accreditation Service, a national accreditation body, which obviously carries weight in terms of credibility. And often the other schemes that are available, the work is undertaken to the scheme's own internal standard and not to international standard, the ISO standards. So because of NQA's UKAS accreditation, obviously the work that we undertake is to ISO, greenhouse gas verification standards, but also the competency of me and my team are all controlled by an ISO standard to make sure we know what we're doing and we've got the necessary background and experience and knowledge and awareness around greenhouse gas quantification work. So there's a lack of availability, therefore, of a mechanism to provide assurance against a company's net zero targets, and also, crucially, their progress against those net zero targets, which is fully credible, fully robust, fully transparent, independent, impartial and objective, available via a formal verification body such as NQA, partly UKAS-accredited, and we'll see the reason why I've said partly very shortly, which is based on, not fully based on international ISO standards, there's a lack of that, and not undertaken to ISO competency requirements. So what can be done about this? So NQA has a net zero aligned service which is aimed at addressing all those different issues that we just looked at in the previous slide. So the name net zero aligned, it's intentional. We haven't plucked it from thin air, if you like. So in 2026, ISO International Standards Organization will launch the world's first ISO standard for demonstrating alignment to net zero. So it will be called ISO 14060, net zero aligned organizations. And that's the part of the name that I've pinched to call our own service net zero aligned. So ISO 14060, I think, this is my personal opinion, but I think that will become a business as usual standard for companies. It will become like ISO 9001 quality management systems has. I think it will just become, a general expectation that companies have adopted and are certified against ISO 14060. So I think it will become a business as usual standard. The ISO's original plan was to launch it at the coalition of the parliaments meeting, the COP, the annual COP meetings, which I think take place in Brazil this year in November. And they plan to launch the ISO 14060 at that event. However, I think it's been delayed. I think it will be 2026 before we see the final version being published. In the meantime, though, we have and we know that ISO 14060 will be based on the existing ISO document. So there's a document called IWA 42, which is published by ISO, and it's called the Net Zero Guidelines. So the people that are developing ISO 14060 are basing it on the existing IWA 42, ISO Net Zero Guidelines. So the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, they involve fairly logical steps. So the step number one is to establish your scope 1, so your direct greenhouse gas emissions, your scope 2, your energy indirect greenhouse gas emissions, and your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, to develop a baseline within the boundary of the organisation. And of course, that's what the standard ISO 14064-1 is all about. It's about getting the initial baseline correct and making sure that the numbers that are being reported are absolutely correct and have been verified. It then involves establishing a science-based pathway to the net zero target that your organisation has set as well. So that takes us back to one of the initial slides that we looked at, where we looked at the temperature increase caps made under the Paris Agreement. So that's a science-based target piece of it. Then establish a mitigation plan, then counterbalance with high quality greenhouse gas removals, so removing greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere, measure and monitor, communicate and report, and ultimately lead to year-on-year improvement. So that's just the basic structure of IWA 42, the ISO Net Zero Guidelines. So NQA's Net Zero Aligned service then, that makes use of the ISO's Net Zero Guidelines. So it's a two-phase process overall. It's phase one involves UKAS-accredited verification, which is a service NQA provide for ISO 14064-1, which is the international standard for quantifying and reporting greenhouse gases, or ISO 14068-1, which is the international standard for transition to net zero for carbon neutrality. The reason that that is phase one in this process is because that phase ensures that the greenhouse gas data, and therefore your baseline, is absolutely correct and has been subject to external accredited verification. So it provides independently verified greenhouse gas baseline, which you can then use to align your science-based net zero targets against. Any existing clients out there, any of you who work for companies who already have ISO 14064 or ISO 14068 verification, and so long as that's done by a UKAS-accredited body like NQA, you may usually proceed directly to phase 2 within the net zero aligned service at that point. The output from phase 1 is what we call a verification opinion statement. So we don't generate certificates, ISO certificates at this stage. We generate a verification opinion statement. So that's phase 1. If there's any companies out there who hold 14064 or 14068 verification with any UKAS accredited verification body, not just NQA, then you would be able to proceed straight to phase 2 with NQA. Phase 2 is a certification audit, and that's for net zero alignment itself. So that certification is undertaken against ISO's net zero guidelines, the IWA 42 document that we discussed. And that really is just to confirm that the organisation is on track to meet its net zero goals. That also involves phase 2, the evaluation of progress against the science-based targets and the reduction milestones. And then the phase 2, obviously phase 1 needs to be repeated annually because it works on the whole to 12 months worth of data. So phase 2 audits would follow very shortly after the phase 1 element of it, and can only proceed where that's the case anyway. And this phase will result in an NQA net zero aligned certificate. So overall, the structure is 2 phases. Phase 1 is UKAS accredited verification to the greenhouse gas quantification standard, or the transition to net zero carbon neutrality standard. Phase 2 is a much shorter duration extra element which takes place after the greenhouse gas verification, and that's undertaken against the ISO net zero guidelines, against the science-based net zero targets to be able to demonstrate that you're on track to meet those targets. So the benefits of net zero aligned then. So there's an element of future proofing around this. As I mentioned previously, I think my personal opinion, ISO 14060 in time will become a business as usual standard for organizations. And obviously by doing this now, you're preparing for the forthcoming ISO 14060 standard. So if there's anybody out there who wants to be amongst the world's first companies to achieve ISO 14060, this is a great starting point because it will get you most of the way there before it's even published, So it also provides for technical credibility. So because it's backed by globally recognized ISO standards, we can have a very, very high level of assurance that the carbon data, the carbon footprint, and the net zero alignment to the science-based targets have been measured accurately and transparently. It also gives an element of market leadership. So, in terms of getting a competitive advantage by demonstrating real and accountable progress towards net zero. It gives your stakeholders confidence because it demonstrates that accountability and integrity to customers and regulators and investors, and also an element of strategic insight. So as I mentioned, myself and my team here at NQA, we all have to have ISO specified competency levels. So by doing the phase 1 and the phase 2 net zero aligned process, it allows expert analysis and it allows findings to be raised, recommendations to be made, which provide that strategic insight and make sure that your organization is on track. So that covers the net zero aligned service. Just anybody that's looking for any further information and support, on NQA's sustainability website, there is the Net Zero Align page, which will give you a really good overview of the detail of the service and the detail of the process itself. There's lots and lots of other information on there as well, you know, blogs, quick reads, fact sheets, lots and lots of webinars if you want to hear me droning on longer. Lots of client case studies as well, and if you need a consultant expert assistance with the development of any of your ISO management systems, we also have an associate partner program where we can put you in touch with consultants as well. So that brings us to the end. Questions. So I think we have a couple of questions at the minute, so I'll just have a look at those. So the first question is, would this be the same for those that hold PAS 2060, which ISO 14068-1 is replacing? Yes, so it depends, Louise, because our NQA's PAS 2060 UKAS accreditation relies on the client using ISO 14064-1 as the means of quantifying their carbon. So if you have accredited PAS 2060, then yes, that would be suitable as an alternative to 14068 for net zero aligned purposes, or as an alternative to 14064 for net zero aligned purposes. There's a question, do you have to include scope 3? If so, can NQA help identify what needs to be included? So this is one of the key elements of the ISO standards. They take what's called a life cycle approach, and it's mandatory. You have to include your indirect emissions, your scope 3 emissions within the carbon footprint itself, within the greenhouse gas quantification process. So it does have to be included. The ISO standards talk about you have to include your significant scope 3 or your significant indirect emissions. So there are some caveats in there around what is significant and what's not. But you do have to include them for greenhouse gas quantification against ISO standards, and also for the net zero aligned as well. NQA can't help you to identify what's needed to be included because we do not offer consultancy. However, we can put you in touch with a consultant if that's what you need to be able to help with the scope 3 quantification process for yourself. If you give me a shout afterwards, I can put you in touch with a good consultant. There's a question, how will this standard compare or differ to SBTI? So I'm not 100% aware, obviously I know about SBTI, but I'm not 100% au fait with the SBTI corporate standard itself. So when the ISO 14060 standard is published, it's very likely to require ISO 14064 as the means of quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore that life cycle approach that I mentioned, and the need to account for scope 3s and the need for independent verification, I think will make it differ from the SBTI process overall. I think that's the last of the questions for the minute. I said this would take 30 minutes. I'm spot on. Anybody got any last questions before we finish up? No? Okay, great. Well, thanks once again for joining me. I hope you all have a lovely weekend, and feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if you need any further clarifications or want to explore any opportunities. Thanks very much, everybody. Goodbye.